How many of you are from Arkansas or Texas or Oklahoma? Now when you drive back home, and when you get, now we're from Arkansas, and we started, I think since 1959, we made a trip back there at least once a year. And most of those have been driving. And when we get to Texas, we feel like we're getting closer to home. And you get to feeling a little bit better. Those are the kind of people that we're used to. When you get into Oklahoma, those of us that are from Arkansas, we're just almost there. We get that warm, cozy feeling because we're closer to home. That's kind of the way I feel as we get into this period that we're calling the early beginnings of the restoration in Great Britain, because we're getting closer to home. Now the blue outline, you only have two items left on it. Where we left off last week was the Reformation period, and we finished up with that. And we're starting now with number 5, Roman numeral 5. And if any of you still need the blue, we've got about 4 or 5 items on there. If you need the blue, then Harold will hand that to you. While you're doing it, let's go ahead and hand out the pink one, because we're going to get into some of those items tonight. The Reformation that we finished last week really didn't work. Why? First of all, it didn't work because they were trying to reform certain things rather than to rebuild or start over again. Now, if you have a house that's totally built out of spec, it's totally wrong from the plan. Sometimes it's far more difficult to try to redo that and bring it up to the plans than it is just to start over again. What they were doing is they were finding this thing that was wrong and trying to reform that, and another group found something else that should be reformed. And so it was less than the most accurate way of trying to restore the New Testament church. Now we've got some other people who are looking at it differently. Rather than taking the apostate, false church as it had developed and trying to change it, now they're saying, let's go back to the Word and start over again, in effect. Let's restore the church that we read about in the New Testament. Dabney Phillips has a book, at least one book, on the Restoration movement that he taught at Faulkner University in Alabama. He's dead now, but he used that textbook to teach his class of college students about the Restoration. But he maintains in his book that he's come across evidence that there were 8 congregations of the Lord's Church in northwest England in the year 1669. Some of you may think, oh, I thought the restoration started here. The restoration of the New Testament church actually occurred in many different places. We're primarily concerned in this study with noting the restoration movement in America. But we need to look at Great Britain, because we're going to see a connection from Great Britain over to this country. So in 1669, there were 8 congregations of the Lord's Church. How do we know that? They dug up some old minutes dated that year of those 8 churches. They called themselves Church of Christ. They practiced baptism by immersion. They celebrated the Lord's Supper every week on Sunday. And they had elders and deacons. Does that sound familiar to you? It ought to. That was the right way. Well, 1669, 8 congregations. I talked to Earl West. Earl is probably our best historian in the church today. He's written 4 books. He's in the process of writing the 5th, In Search for the Ancient Order. If you can only buy one set of books on the Restoration, I would probably recommend that you buy his 4 volumes. And there are other good books that are available. But Earl West really has done so much work in this area. When I talked to him, and I mentioned the 1669 date, he mentioned a brother who was doing a paper, and he had found that some 7 years earlier actually, they had discovered other congregations of the Lord's Church in the same general area in Great Britain. That these were people who were trying to go back to the church that we read about in the New Testament. I find that exciting. In 1735, we're talking a long time before the Restoration movement started here in the United States, a man named John Davis, a young preacher in the 5th district of Scotland, was preaching New Testament Christianity. This was 25 years before Thomas Campbell, the father of Alexander Campbell, was born. Marvin Hastings has a good book on the Restoration. He calls it the Saga of a Movement. By the way, if you would be interested, I could bring to you a list of restoration books. I probably have, I guess I have maybe 150 books on the restoration movement. Maybe that's too. Maybe I only have 100. I don't know. But I can give you a list of some good books, and from that maybe you can select. But The Saga of a Movement is an excellent book by Marvin Hastings. And he, too, goes back into Great Britain to locate these restoration churches that existed way back. He said that in March of 1818, the church in New York, which was probably the Old Scotch Independent, as they call themselves, or the Scotch Baptist was another way, led, I believe, by Henry Eyre. If I'm not mistaken, it's probably that congregation, sent out some letters to various congregations that they heard were in existence, who were pleading for a restoration of New Testament Christianity in Great Britain. They received letters back and found that there were churches in the Great Britain, primarily in Scotland, that had the same plea as did they. That is, let's return to the ancient order. Let's return to the church that we read about in the New Testament. A letter came from Glasgow, Scotland, and in it the writer said, some churches as ours have existed in Scotland at least for 30 to 40 years. Well, I would put the beginning of the restoration movement in Great Britain, whichever figure you choose, as considerably sooner than that which took place in our country. Alexander Campbell was born, by the way, in 1788. So all of these things that we're talking about preceded Alexander Campbell. A congregation in Kirkcaldy began as far back as 1798, and small churches existed in Ireland, in Dungannon, near Dungannon, and a place called Costain, near Chester in 1804. Now, the groundwork for these churches was probably done by Archibald MacLean. We're going to come across that name a little bit later as we see some work by independent congregations in Great Britain. In the 18th century and early in the 19th century, there sprang up in the British Isles a considerable number of small, independent congregations or movements using the restoration phraseology. What do I mean by that? I mean such phrases as, we need to go back to the original. We need to restore the church of the New Testament. We need to be today as they were then. Such phrases as that characterized many of these small movements. Now, these were congregations or movements that said we need to go back to the Bible, back to the New Testament, and restore the church with its doctrine that it taught then, with its ordinances, with its worship, methods of worship, with its organization, with its name. One historian said he had counted some 40 different independent movements that had similar claims of restoration. They all remained small, and some of them vanished away, but in the aggregate, they had a great deal of influence. I think that we can say that Alexander Campbell and Thomas Campbell, his father, probably were influenced to one degree or another by these independent movements. They call themselves Brethren, or they call themselves Church of Christ, or some similar name. Their common idea was that the churches were cluttered up with human additions, that creeds had been written and adhered to by these denominations that did not have their authority coming from the Bible, that worship was too formal, that the clergy was too professional and too eager for material gains. They were democratic in their government, and they were autonomous, meaning that each congregation was self-ruled. So they had some things that were admirable as they were seeking to restore the New Testament church. These were independent movements. Now, one of the main ones that we would mention, first of all, was that which was started by a man named John Glass. And I don't even apologize for the quality of that picture because I didn't take it originally. It's a painting and a photograph of a painting that's in a book. And I've got a few of these pictures that I like, and I've got some that are missing. And if you ever come across a picture of James O'Kelly, save it for me. I'll be very careful with your picture till I make a copy and return it. And another is Elias Smith. I'd like to have a picture of Elias Smith. So those two I don't have. Now these two, this man is John Glass, and this is Sandeman Robert Sandeman, his son-in-law. What they did, these men started, John Glass started it, in 1728. He pulled out of the Church of Scotland, which would be the Presbyterian Church. He had some problems with the Presbyterian Church that they did not adhere, or the Church of Scotland, one and the same, that they did not adhere to the Word. His work was carried on by his son-in-law, and the congregations were more often called Sandemanian than they were Glassite, but this man carried on the work that was started by John Glass. They were probably never more than 30 congregations in Great Britain that were started by these men, independent churches, and there were a few, very few, in our country in New England. The English chemist Faraday, Michael Faraday, was a member of a Sandemanian congregation. They probably wouldn't like to be called that, but that's what some have called to identify that particular group. The father-in-law of Shelley, the poet, was at one time in his youth a preacher in the Sandemanian movement. John Glass withdrew from the Church of Scotland primarily because of this connection that the church had with church and state. He said, that's not biblical, that's not right, it ought not to be so. He also did not like the fact that the Church of Scotland had synods, law-making bodies bound on the church. He said there is no Bible for that. The New Testament church knew no such practice. He believed each congregation should be self-ruling or autonomous. He believed that they should have the right to conduct their public worship on their own. They should have the right to choose a minister and discipline their members and should not be dictated to by the state church. So they were moving, indeed, in the right direction. Glass's biographer tells us how concerned that Glass was with adhering to the New Testament. One example that he used was the fact that they looked at what was taking place at the Church of Scotland and how often they took the Lord's Supper. And they said, it is not right what they're doing. We need to take of it more often. And then after they started taking the Lord's Supper about once a month, then they looked at the Scriptures and said, if we are going to be guided by the Word, then we have no more right to take of the Lord's Supper once each month than the Church of Scotland does less often. In the New Testament, they observe the Lord's Supper every week, and if we are to be guided by the Word, then that's what we ought to do, and that's what they did. Another example was in the matter of eldership. They went to the Scriptures in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1 to find out that there is to be certain qualifications for the elders, but they were binding more than the Scriptures were binding. They were saying that anyone who would be considered for the eldership had to have a university education and had to be familiar with the ancient languages. After restudying this matter, they dropped those qualifications because they were not required in the Scriptures. Also, they came to the conclusion that there had to be a plurality of elders in a congregation. Robert Sandeman, the son-in-law, was a theological thinker. In 1755, he proved himself to not only be a good thinker, but a good writer as well. He wrote a book of 600 pages. And the reason that he wrote the book was in answer to a man named Harvey, who wrote a book espousing the typical Calvinistic line of a direct operation of the Holy Spirit had to take place. There wasn't anything you could do about it. If you're going to be saved, you're going to be saved, and such like. If you're going to be lost, you're going to be lost. There's nothing that you can do about it. It's all predestined, and it's too bad if it happens, but that's the way it is. So Sandeman wrote a 600-page book, and he said that faith is based on evidence. On evidence, a man believes, and based on his faith, then he acts. And the business of predestination is not to be verified by the Scriptures. In fact, all of these items that are so typically taught at this time by Calvinistic preachers, he would deny. And he did a fantastic job in his book of denying those things. The book was first printed in 1755. It was printed again 4 years later. It was printed again in 1803. Now, it could be noted here that this was 1 year before Barton W. Stone established a restoration congregation in Cane Ridge, Kentucky. Alexander Campbell at this time was 15 years of age, a teenager living in Ireland with his family. The writings of Sandeman probably had some influence, maybe a lot of influence on Alexander Campbell in later years. Now, one man wrote a book and said that Alexander Campbell was just a Sandemanian, meaning that all that he stood for he got from this man. But one other brother wrote a book and he said, no, out of the 15 items that he talked about Sandeman pushing or teaching, Campbell only agreed with 4 of the 15. Campbell himself said, I took an entire winter and studied the writings and all the discussion pertaining to the writings of Sandeman. And he said, on the whole, I find him to be a giant among pygmies, but I reject his system as a whole. There were some things on which they did agree. They did agree that we need to stress a restoration of the New Testament church. We need to stress the fact that they had a plurality of elders then. We need to have a plurality of elders now. They both believed and practiced in the weekly observance of the Lord's Supper. They refused to call Sunday the Sabbath. It's not. Saturday's the Sabbath. And so they had some similarities, but Alexander Campbell was not a Sandemanian any more than he was anybody else's man just because he read his book. Sandeman came to America and he established a congregation in Danbury, Connecticut. One man who was a member of that congregation named Louis Osborne did not accept Sandeman's teaching on baptism. At this time, Sandeman still believed that infant baptism was correct. Remember I said last time, and maybe the time before, these men were coming out of the dark into the sunlight, and some of them came out further than others. But this man Osborne, in his study of the Scriptures, did not believe that infant baptism was valid. And it came time for his child either to be baptized or to reject it. He rejected it, went over to New York to talk to a man named Henry Eyre. Now, Henry Eyre has 2 things that I should mention about him that are important. He wrote a pamphlet on baptism being immersion for the remission of sins, and he was far ahead of his time in recognizing that. And when we study Walter Scott, we're going to find out that that very pamphlet that he wrote wound up in Scott's hands, and he said, Eureka, that's it. And he went to New York and studied with Henry Eyre. Henry Eyre's son was Isaac Eyre. Isaac Eyre was the editor of the Christian Standard and the Standard Publishing Company. And Isaac, unfortunately, became one of the leaders of the liberal wing of the Lord's Church and probably contributed a great deal into the split that occurred between, that was later recognized as the Christian Church and the Church of Christ. All right, Louis Osborne went to New York. He talked to Henry Eyre. Henry Eyre immersed him, and Osborne went back and baptized his wife and 2 other people. They broke away from the Sandeman congregation and established an independent congregation of the Lord's Church. Now, Alexander Campbell, in 1840, this is many years later, that little congregation was started in 1817. But Campbell, when he went to that congregation in 1840, found that the property that they owned was in the name of the Reformed Baptist Society, and his visit resulted in the changing of the title and in establishing a fellowship between them and the groups associated with Alexander Campbell. Robert Sandeman died in Danbury, Connecticut, April the 2nd, 1771. On his gravestone, it says this in part: Here lies, until the resurrection, the body of Robert Sandeman, a native of Perth, North Britain, who in the face of continual opposition from all sorts of men, long and boldly contended for the ancient faith. So here is a man who indeed is to be commended, another one to be commended. We move on to another group of independents that established movements or congregations, and we find them to be very important in the life of Alexander Campbell. The names are Robert and James Haldane, brothers. I don't have their pictures. If you have their pictures, I'd be delighted to make copies. But this was a small movement by 2 brothers in Scotland. You notice how Scotland plays a heavy part here in this period when we're discussing the Restoration movement in Great Britain. They were disgusted with the sterility and the formalism of the established church, the Church of Scotland, remember, which was really Presbyterian. They were alarmed at the teaching coming from these ministers because it wasn't biblical. They spent their time freely in promoting evangelical revival in Scotland. At their own expense they brought a man named Roland Hill to that part of Scotland and built him a tabernacle from which he could preach. They were so sincere and involved in wanting to preach and to teach New Testament Christianity and to expand the borders of the kingdom. But everywhere they turned, the established church, the state church, just squelched them. And finally they became so disgusted with it all that in 1799 they withdrew from the Church of Scotland and organized an independent church in Edinburgh. Now James Haldane was 31 years old at the time. He began preaching for that independent congregation and preached for them for the next 50 years. The congregation, the movement believed in congregational independence as it was in New Testament times. They believed in a weekly observance of the Lord's Supper as in New Testament times. And their conviction was that true reformation of the church that we read about in the New Testament was not only possible, but was imperative. So they were searching and digging and delving and pushing, trying to go back to the church that we read about in the New Testament. Now in 1805, James Haldane wrote a book, and if I read, well, I'll just read you the title of the book. They have a lot bigger title pages then. Listen to this. Here's the title of the book that he wrote. A View of the Social Worship and Ordinances Observed by the First Christians. The reason I'm reading this to you is to show you the emphasis that's placed on restoration. And ordinances observed by the first Christians, drawn from the Scriptures alone, being an attempt to enforce their divine obligation and to represent the guilty and the evil consequences of neglecting them. That's the title of the book. Chapter 1. The title of chapter 1 is this: There is reason to presume that the New Testament furnishes instructions concerning every part of the worship and conduct of Christian societies, as well as concerning the faith and practice of individuals. Chapter 2. All Christians are bound to observe the universal and approved practices of the first churches recorded in Scripture. That's restoration language to me. That's saying that they're trying to get back. They're going back through the centuries to establish the church that Jesus left on earth, to reestablish it in their time. Restore it, if you please. Now, at this time, when Haldane wrote his book, he still did not believe in immersion as the mode of baptism. He believed in infant baptism. How could he if he were such a smart man? Again, here he is coming out of the darkness. 2 years later, after he wrote the book, he came to the conclusion, based on study of the Scriptures, that infant baptism was not correct. And he and his became immersionists. They buried people in water who would be baptized, and they baptized only adults. Now, one of the ministers in the independent movement led by the Haldanes was a man named Greville Ewing. Now, Ewing was important to Alexander Campbell. He taught and believed in congregational independence. He taught the weekly observance of the Lord's Supper and other restoration pleas that we still make today. But he and Alexander Campbell became good friends. There was a time when we talk about Alexander, we'll get more into this, but there was a year that Alexander Campbell spent in Scotland. He was really on his way to America. The boat that he was on with his family, his mother and sisters, had a wreck on some rocks, and they were forced to come to shore, and they stayed in Scotland for a year while Alexander went to University of Scotland. The University of Glasgow, actually. That year that he spent there, he became acquainted with Greville Ewing and James Haldane. He often went to hear Haldane preach. It was not unusual in that congregation where Haldane preached to have 1,000, 1,500 people. One writer says that he probably attended more than often the Presbyterian church on Sunday morning, and on Sunday evening he'd go over and hear James Haldane preach. You can rest assured that the preaching of James Haldane indeed had an effect on Alexander Campbell. At the end of his one-year period in Scotland, Alexander Campbell gave up the Presbyterian Church, the church of which he was a member, the church of which his father was a minister. But it's impossible to say how many congregations there were of this Haldane group, because they didn't call themselves the Haldane Church. They were just independent congregations. But they had a goal to restore New Testament Christianity, and they believed that it was possible and practiced it. Now, with that overall view of the restoration movement, we should be, on our blue sheet, if I can find one now, we should be ready to start with section 6 at the bottom, early beginnings of the restoration in the New World. Now, we've left New Mexico, and we're in Texas now. We're beginning to feel the homecoming, and that's where we started out to be when we talked about the apostate church, and we talked about the early pre-Reformation people and the Reformation people. All of these people were important because they were planting some seeds and preparing the ground so that others could come along and accomplish what they perhaps were unable to do. Now, in the early 1700s or late 1600s, the cry from the pulpits of the Church of England was, "Go to the New World, people. Go to the New World. You need to go to convert those natives that will never be converted if you don't go there. You need to go and establish for England what Spain has established, what others have established in the New World. They're making headway. They're taking much of the New World, whereas we're staying in England and losing out. So go over there and establish for England what others have done for their countries. Go over there and you can have your own land and your own houses that you can never have here." So it was a mission that they should go to the New World. But also there were some financial aspects involved. This would be good for England to establish a relationship in the New World. So many people were encouraged, and they came to this country, this New World. It wasn't the United States then, of course. But they came to the New World and established for the Church of England a foothold primarily in Virginia. But as we look at where the Church of England was strongest, they were the strongest church in not only Virginia, but New York, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So the plea for the English people to go to the New World was successful. They came here. They came in droves. The Baptists came in 1684. The Dutch Reform came in 1685. The French Huguenots in 1685. The Quakers, 1672. The Presbyterians came from Scotland and Northern Ireland in the 18th century. Those who dissented, though, with the Church of England were going to be persecuted. The four Quakers who disagreed and taught something that was contrary to the Church of England were hanged by the necks until dead on Boston Common in 1661. In 1651, a small group of Baptists were fined, imprisoned, and compelled to attend the Church of England. In Rhode Island, the Baptists had established a foothold there that allowed for toleration. So people who went to Rhode Island found that they were free to pretty much worship the way they wanted to. The government in Pennsylvania was controlled by the Quakers, and they allowed a much freer reign there. And the people that went to Pennsylvania were allowed to carry on the religious practices without interference from the government. The Church of England, though, ruled affairs in the colonies with an iron hand. For the most part, the Church of England says, "Do as we say, or you will be punished." And the ministers were taught to teach the people that. And example after example occurred so that they could see that if they didn't adhere to the teachings of the Church of England, that they would indeed be punished. For example, in March of 1624, in Virginia, the assembly held that all people in Virginia must attend the services of the Church of England, or they would be fined. If you missed one Sunday, you would be fined £1 of coffee. If you missed a month of Sundays, then you would be fined 50 pounds. Every person was told to yield ready to obedience to the canons of England under the pain of censure. That's what they were told. No man was allowed to sell his tobacco until the minister from the Church of England came and inspected it and took that portion that he thought was best. Clergymen were kept busy hunting and punishing all types of heretics. Folks, this is our country. They objected over there to religious persecution, but they come over here and they practice it just as it was practiced on them in the old country. In 1632 in Virginia, the Act of Conformity was passed as a state or a territorial law so that the purity of the doctrine of the Church of England would be preached, it says, publicly and privately. And if it isn't adhered to, then they will be punished who do not teach it as the Church of England says it ought to be taught. Now you can see where people would begin to build up a resentment for the Church of England. It gets to such a point that 2/3 of the people are in total disagreement with the Church of England by the time the Revolutionary War occurs. Quakers were persecuted and described as unreasonable and turbulent sort of people who, contrary to the laws, daily gathers in assemblies and congregations of people teaching and publishing lies. Lies meaning disagreement with the Church of England. Quakers were imprisoned without bail. Captains of ships were fined 100 pounds sterling if they were caught bringing Quakers into Virginia. Persecution raged against the Baptists who came to Virginia in 1714. By the time of the Revolutionary War, they were quite numerous. In January of 1768, 4 of the Baptists were arrested for teaching that which was contrary to the Church of England, and the famous Patrick Henry rode 50 miles to defend these 4 Baptists. And before the court, he said in a very dramatic way, he said, "These men are charged with what?" He said, "Preaching the gospel of the Son of God." And then he held his hands up and looked to heaven and he says, "Great God." And they set the 4 Baptists free. He was a powerful lawyer for these people. But that is just one incident of many cases of persecution. In spite of the persecution and the nonconformists increased in number, and while the dissenters were increasing in number, the opposition to the Church of England was increasing. It was 1786 before Thomas Jefferson's Bill of Religious Freedom was passed, and it was a bit later before all the vestiges of a church-state relationship were abolished. But finally, it was done, and we today have religious freedom in this country, but they didn't have it in the beginning. James Madison, who would later become President of the United States, had this to say about the conditions of his time. He said, "Poverty and luxury prevail among all sects, pride, ignorance, and knavery among the priesthood." He's talking about the Church of England. "And vice and wickedness among the laity." That is bad enough, but it is not the worst, I have to tell you. That diabolical, hell-conceived principle of persecution rages among some, and to their eternal infamy, the clergy furnish their quota of imps for such purposes. There are at this time in adjacent counties not less than 5 or 6 well-meaning persons in close jail for publishing their religious sentiments, which in the main are very orthodox. So we're talking about the religious climate of the New World. And we would come now to a note of the Methodists. How did the Methodists come to be? As early as 1729, John Wesley in England, noting the formality and the tyranny of the Church of England, says we've got to be better than this. We've got to be holier than this. And so he established some societies which became known as the Wesleyan Societies. These were not intended to abolish the Church of England. They were intended to improve the holiness of the members and the clergy of England. John Wesley, who is credited with being the founder of the Methodist Church, never was a Methodist. He lived and died as a priest in the Church of England. He was buried in his Anglican robes, but he indeed was the founder of the Methodist Church. Wesleyan societies came to be established by persons demanding a holier life, on the part of the members and the clergy of the Church of England. These Wesleyan societies came to the New World and they formed in the colonies. And while the Church of England was losing favor with the people because they were associated with tyranny, England was tyrannizing the colonies and taking a death grip on the colonies. The Church of England was associated with England, but the Wesleyan societies were looked upon with favor, and they looked upon them as more a part of a free country in opposition to the Church of England. But the problem of ordination came up because the Wesleyan society people, the preachers, could not baptize, they couldn't perform funerals, and do other things that clergymen were supposed to do because they were not ordained. They believed in the Church of England at this time that only an ordained person could perform these acts, and you could only be ordained by a person who was ordained by a person who was ordained. And so this created a problem, and the Anglican priests would not ordain the Wesleyan preachers because they resented them. But the time came when John Wesley sent a man named Coke and some others over to this country, and they did ordain the Wesleyan preachers. So we began to see a stamp of approval being placed on them as they are ordained to perform these acts. Not long after Coke and his group met with the preachers and from the Wesleyan societies, it was on Christmas Day in 1784 that Francis Asbury became the superintendent of the church in this country. Now, what was it at this time? Was it the Methodist Church? Not yet. Was it the Wesleyan Society? Still. Was it the Church of England? Yes. It still all kind of had a part in this thing. But it was at this conference that the discipline for the Methodist Episcopal Church was accepted. And here, for the first time, the Methodist Episcopal Church was named. Now, that was 1784. So at that point on, we have a Methodist church, which was really came out of the Wesleyan societies, which came out of the Church of England. Now the name didn't set well with some, and the church government didn't set well with some. Even John Wesley said the government is not apostolic, it's not biblical, but it's the best under these circumstances. Scarcely had the Methodist Church begun that it had its first internal conflicts. It was over the government of, the arrangement of the government of the church. This Francis Asbury, who was named as the superintendent of the Methodist Church, caused a lot of ruffled feathers. And one man that had a constant battle with him was a man named James O'Kelly. And James O'Kelly was a part of the Restoration, and it should be on your blue sheet down at number B under 6. James O'Kelly was a Methodist preacher, and he was an antagonist of this man who had placed himself, he was accused of placing himself at the head of the church. They said Francis Asbury is greedy. His motto was pay, pray, and obey. That was the way that he ruled with an iron hand. And many objected to him, including James O'Kelly. But back up a little bit. James O'Kelly sounds very Irish, was of Irish descent, but he was born in Virginia. His opposition to Asbury was very vocal, and others joined with him. But he was not always a Methodist. In fact, at one point in time, he wasn't very religious. He married a woman named Elizabeth Meeks in 1760, and they had 2 sons. When the older son was about 12, some Methodist or Wesleyan preachers came into his area, and his wife and older son were converted to Methodism or the Wesleyan societies by these people. The older boy, the older brother, wanted to be a preacher, and O'Kelly says, no, don't do it. He at this time was not religious himself. The son, by the way, became a member of the state house or state legislature in North Carolina and served there for many years. Not too long after they were converted, the bug struck O'Kelly, and he became very interested as he read the sermons that were being sent over by Wesley from England, and he was especially appreciative of the fact that Wesley was saying that the scriptures are all sufficient. Now we're going to have to stop there just because it's 8 o'clock, And I'll take up next week as we continue with James O'Kelly. Very interesting, fiery individual, but he did some good as he was trying to get the people back to the New Testament church. Now, if you would like to have a copy of the blue booklet, please feel free to take one. And I have the lesson with just the beginning of